Ladies and gentlemen, this is Israel's democracy via the deep state. Please welcome Director of the Center for Middle East and International Law at the Antonin Scalia School of Law, Eugene Kontorovich, host of The Josh Hammer Show, Josh Hammer, and your moderator, CPAC Senior Fellow for Israel and Jewish Affairs, Yitz Tendler.
Okay, good afternoon, CPAC. It is good afternoon. It is so great to be here with two towering legal minds and great patriots, American patriots, Josh Hammer and Professor Eugene Kontorovich, to talk about a bunch of exciting issues. But before we talk about those issues, I know this is a very biblically literate audience. And you all are familiar with the Book of Esther, which is a book which will be read by Jews around the world in just a few days. We're celebrating the anniversary of the miracles that occurred in those books, and it's an ancient story of anti-Semitism and a miraculous salvation that the Lord allowed the Jewish people at the time to be saved. Looking at America today, question for my two panelists here, what are some thoughts you have about Jew hatred today in the United States of America, some parallels you see, some insights? Josh, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so great to be back at CPAC. So look, I mean, our stance when it comes to Jew hatred, anti-Semitism should be clear, unequivocal, unambiguous. We despise it, we loathe it, and it has no part of our movement whatsoever. Period. Full stop, end of story. And you know, I'm grateful to CPAC and to Matt Schlapp, who had a very powerful statement condemning Nick Fuentes just yesterday. But we've seen these outbursts just from all across the spectrum, whether it's the Ilhan Omar on the far left to Kanye West and Nick Fuentes. I'm not even going to call them the far right. I won't dignify them with that term. But wherever it comes from, we have an obligation and duty to condemn it. It is evil, and that's it. It's really that simple.
Excellent. Thank you, Gene.
So today, the most important kind of anti-Semitism is the anti-Semitism that makes the largest number of Jews unsafe. And the largest number of Jews in the world live in the state of Israel. And a political program, even if it doesn't announce itself as anti-Semitic, that limits Israel's ability to defend itself, that supports the Palestinian Authority as it pays for the murder of Jews, that calls for areas of Jews' historical homeland, Judea and Samaria, to be off limits for Jews, to be Judenrein, that is a program that is in practice anti-Semitic and demands by the current administration that Jews not live in parts of their biblical homeland. It's hard to come up with a nice name for that.
Thank you, Eugene. Okay. On to some of the more wonky issues to discuss. The topic of this panel has to do with Israel's judicial reform. Many of you here in this audience probably know there's a lot of uproar around judicial reform in Israel specifically. And recently, Josh, you wrote an article called, which included the term "much ado about nothing," that all this uproar is a little bit overblown, it's a little bit exaggerated. Can you share a little bit about why you think that?
Sure. So, I actually debated Alan Dershowitz on this very issue just a few nights ago. So what's happening in Israel, for those of you who follow the news, you've seen the protests in the streets of Tel Aviv, hundreds of thousands of people just going out there, probably have no idea what in the world they're talking about, to be totally candid with you. And the very first thing to say about what's happening in Israel, from my perspective, is that we shouldn't care. This debate is fundamentally a constitutional separation of powers debate internal to the state of Israel. And the very fact that the world purports to care, that President Joe Biden saw fit to stick his neck out and condemn the Netanyahu government, that is indicative itself of an anti-Semitic double standard, because there is no other country in the world that would be debating a separation of powers dispute between its legislature and its court that would attract the eyes of the United Nations and all of these liberals. The key point, and I'll turn it over to Eugene after this, the key point to bear in mind when it comes to the judicial reform debate in Israel is that the Israeli Supreme Court has arrogated more power to itself than any court in the entire Western world. Anyone in the entire country can effectively bring any lawsuit at any time for any reason whatsoever. And the key part here, in the United States, when you litigate to the United States Supreme Court, the court is going to cite the Constitution if they're going to strike down a statute. Over there, you can strike down a law because it is unreasonable. So these liberal secular elites get elected to the Supreme Court, totally override the entire right-leaning government. It's a total travesty, but thankfully I think that we're going to get it passed.
Excellent.
Yeah, so you're going to hear in Israel that Israel is taking measures that undermine America's shared values with Israel. And nothing can be further from the truth. Because let's talk about what the actual situation is in Israel. In Israel, there is a deep state. There is a small group of elite lawyers and technocrats that have managed to control the country such that elections don't matter. And as they say in Israel, vote right, get left. Because even when you elect a right-wing government, the judges and other bureaucrats prevent right-wing policies from being implemented. So this is what they're doing in Israel that's supposedly against American values. They're discussing having politicians have some role in picking the judges. Currently, the judges are picked by a committee controlled by themselves. In other words, sitting Supreme Court judges control the committee, with a few other lawyers, that picks their own successors. So we're talking about having politicians have some role in the appointment of judges. The Supreme Court in Israel has said that it can consider whether amendments to Israel's pseudo-constitution, to the laws that they have claimed are constitutional, they can declare constitutional amendments unconstitutional as against the true higher secret liberal constitution that only they are privy to. So they can strike down constitutional amendments, and they have said that the Attorney General, who you'd think is the government's lawyer, can veto any government policy without as much as a written opinion. So if the government wants to do reform on the borders, refugee policy, if the government now, as it's talking about, to have a death penalty for terrorists, the Attorney General says, the court's not going to like it, and that's the end of it. And the Attorney General in Israel can come and actually argue in court against the government. The Supreme Court has also declared that it has the power to impeach effectively the Prime Minister and remove officials elected by the people. So those are the things we're trying to change in a way that's going to make Israel only more like America, strengthen democracy, and strengthen the values that we hold in common with other Western democracies.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you. So looking out at this great audience, I see what we call the grassroots core of the conservative movement here in the United States of America. So a two-part question for both of you. Number one is, why should your average rank-and-file CPAC attendee care so much about judicial reform in Israel, number one? And number two is, practically speaking, as activists, what can our activists do to move the needle on this issue?
So great questions. First, I just want to very briefly emphasize something that Eugene said, because I think it's an important point to drive home. So what Eugene has accurately said is that the court over there has taken unto itself the ability to overturn the Constitution itself. So that is basically the equivalent here of if you have a liberal United States Supreme Court of literally just repealing the Second Amendment, of saying you do not actually have a right to own guns. It is a truly insane system. So I just want to underscore that point. Now, why should the grassroots here care? Well, I have a few reasons for that. One is it's important to bear in mind that what's happening there, so Netanyahu, who I'm a fan of, obviously, he's firmly right of center. His coalition is probably the most right-wing coalition in the history of the Jewish state of Israel in its 75-year history. They cannot get anything done. They literally cannot do anything unless judicial reform passes first, because no matter what they do, the court can then just strike it down on the most arbitrary grounds possible, because it is unreasonable to try to incorporate parts of Judea and Samaria into Israel or some other policy that you can possibly think of. So if you support the U.S.-Israel alliance, if you support the Benjamin Netanyahu government, you have a duty, I think, to care about judicial reform, because literally nothing will happen unless this happens first. And one other reason I think to care about this is that the analogies for what the Netanyahu government is going through compared to what Donald Trump went through for his 4 years are incredibly stark. The parallels are actually, I would say, are possibly outright eerie. So both Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu have been indicted and are being prosecuted for incredibly frivolous, legally dubious grounds, I think would be a mild way of saying it. And just as you have judicial oligarchy over there, Trump fought the deep state. It's the exact same thing. That's why this panel is called the deep state. You have a cloistered cluster of homogenous groupthink liberals who are trying to overturn the will of the democratically elected right-of-center government. That was the exact dynamic Donald Trump faced. It's the exact dynamic Netanyahu's facing now. It's very similar, actually, in a way to kind of what happened in Brazil recently. Poland, Hungary, other countries around the world have faced similar struggles. But it is our duty as conservatives in the US, Hungary, Brazil, Israel, wherever, to kind of stand in unison and support one another's efforts, I think.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah. It's amazing, and it's almost like it's part of a divine plan. But when you look at the history of Israel, Israel is always at the forefront of fighting every challenge to freedom faced by the West. During the Cold War, Israel was the forward bastion in the Middle East against Soviet communism. During the past 20 years, Israel is at the forefront of the fight against political Islamism. And today, there's a new phenomenon that we see, and we see it in Europe, and we see it throughout the world, which is a threat to democracy that comes from inside Western institutions that seek to redefine democracy. And that's what's happening in Israel. And if they succeed in Israel, it's not going to stop in Israel. There is a new definition of democracy. When they say that they're planning to make this, to end democracy in Israel, obviously they mean promote democracy, as in not have the people's elected officials removable by an elite priestly class that is unelected and unresponsive to the people. But they say, you know what? Democracy no longer means people vote for the government. Democracy means you get the policy results arrived at by, let's say, Germany and France 2 years ago, or you're not democratic. Democracy is about results, right? It's like the new definition of equality. Either you achieve all of the social policies we think are important, or you're not democratic. And that idea is going to come here. It's also an idea about the rule of experts. The rule of experts, and we saw where that got us during the COVID pandemic. But there's something that the American grassroots supporters of Israel, people here at CPAC, and it's so important, I know, for people in Israel to have your support. There's a few things you can do. Normally, I would say Israel's constitutional structure, Israel's political system, is a matter for Israelis. But now that Secretary of State Blinken, now that President Biden have gotten involved, now that they are targeting these reforms, it's important for you to talk to your senators. It's important for American politicians, American activists, to be loudly heard in Israel as saying, if you have political selection of judges, we're still going to be friends with you. Of course, we have political selection of judges here in America. And it's important for Israelis to hear that message because they're feeling very isolated. Now, there's another tactic that is being used by opponents of the reform. They're creating a climate of crisis and hysteria to scare off foreign investors and try to isolate Israel economically. Israel is a small country, and this is something that scares even people who support the reforms, are afraid that it's going to scare off foreign investors, foreign tourists. So now it's more important than ever. If you have a business deal with Israel, do it. If you want to go to Israel, now is the time to do it. It's important for Israel to feel that they're not going to be isolated as a result of not wanting to be governed by an unelected, self-selecting group of lawyers.
Excellent. Go ahead, Joe.
So I want to just emphasize one other key point that Eugene made here, which is this conflation, and it is a disingenuous conflation that the left in Israel and the left in the United States makes between democracy on the one hand and liberalism or progressivism on the other hand. So the judicial reform package that the Netanyahu government is pushing is, by very definition of the word democracy, it is pro-democracy, it is democratic. It's trying to take power back to the people away from unaccountable elites. If you think back to the Dobbs decision, which was a heroic and courageous decision from the Supreme Court last June, the left did the exact same thing here. They said that this was an anti-democracy, anti-democratic move to overturn the wretched decision of Roe versus Wade. But if you think about it, Dobbs was the most pro-democracy decision imaginable. It literally gave power back to the people to decide that the unborn child is worth protecting under the rule of law. So, there's a very plugged-in crowd here, so I would just remind you, be very, very, very vigilant about what the left does here. It is very clever, it's disingenuous, but they know exactly what they're doing. Democracy is not the same thing as liberalism. You can be pro-democracy and conservative, or pro-democracy and liberal, but there are increasingly few of those out there, I think, Yitz.
And Israel's at the forefront of this battle right now and needs your support.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Eugene. Thank you all. God bless you all. Thanks for everything that all of you do.